All right, so we've gone through our review. So now what we're going to do is we're going to just jump into this idea of the Persian Empire has conquered the Babylonian Empire. The people of God are now then replaced as their owners, or so to speak, their rulers are now the Persians instead of the Babylonians, and they are allowing them to go back. Not everybody goes back. Okay, so that's why the Bible and history talks, James talks about this, and the history talks about the diaspora, capital D, diaspora. That's the dispersion of Jews that occurred all over the ancient world, which continued on, as we'll find out next week, during the Roman Empire, and continued on even until, today. There's a dispersion of Jews all over the world. And so what we find is that the Persians not only allowed, and this just seems like God's hand is in it completely, not only allowed but encouraged the Jews to worship their God in their land and do that just the way that God had commanded. And you'll see that in the writings of Cyrus. If you ever go and see, or if you want to look at his entire script that we have available, all you have to do is Google it. And it's translated for you in English, and it'll give you Cyrus's proclamation. Now, I don't want you to think that it mentions the Jews as ones that can go home. He mentions basically the empire, you may go home, anyone. This was to everyone. So it wasn't just the Jews who were allowed to come home. The Persian king allowed all, according to this historical artifact that was found in Babylon, for them to be able to go back. Now, you remember that when we look at the Greeks, you're going to find something that I think we've all, historically speaking, have a connection to. Because without Greek history, your life would not be the way it is today. There would not be the United States of America as we know it. We would not have a justice system. We would not have a jury system. We would not have a democratic republic. We might have a republic if Rome came on the scene, but the democratic part of it would probably not happen. And yet, it is fascinating to me that the Greeks arose as a power in the world at their time, because there's nothing to suggest by their geography that they could become powerful. They didn't have a major river system in Greece. It was all mountainous. It was a terrible place to grow crops. But the sea was their key to their prosperity. And they got in those ships and they went all over the Mediterranean and they traded with people everywhere. So as they did so, they came in contact with people. And in doing so, they decided that they would colonize certain areas. Now, we're going to start looking at the Persia versus Greece time period. And if you look right up here, you're going to see this is called an Ionian revolt. Those little stars right there, red stars, are where the Ionians revolted against the Persians. You see, if you look at a map of ancient Greece, watch my laser, all of this right around in here would be considered ancient Greece. Not just the mainland, but all these islands over here and over here on Western Asia Minor. That's where they colonized. So when the Persians came in with their hordes, whoops, I pressed the wrong one. Come on, go back. When the Persians came in with their hordes of armies, they took this, but these Ionians were Greek related. And so when they all decided, hey, we're going to revolt, they asked Athens over here. Athens was one of the greatest city-states in ancient Greece. They asked Athens along with Sparta, will you help us? Sparta turned them down. Athens said yes. And Persia remembered it. So there was a revolt. There was a rebellion. Sardis, the capital of this area, was burned by the Ionians, and it really burned the Persians. So they came after them. They crushed the revolt, and they just kind of left it in their mind. Darius the First left it in his mind. I am going to get those Greeks for doing what they did. And so now you have the Greeks and the Persians at odds with one another. So as this goes on, you're going to see this area right here is the mainland of Greece, and in this peninsula right here, you have Sparta right there, one of the greatest city-states, Athens right here, another great city-state, but all of these are city-states. They were never united politically until Alexander the Great forced them to, and we'll talk about that later. They, however, were united in their religion and in their politics and in their sense of history and ancestry. Okay? And so as a result of that, if anybody picked on them, they did often band together and hold to their traditions that way. But they often fought against one another until Persia came, and that was the first time they really banded together to help one another out. The Golden Age of Greece occurs between 500 and 300 BC. All these wonderful things that we have in Western civilization, or you might not call them wonderful, but they are considered wonderful by historians, that have been left as a Grecian legacy to us. And certainly some of our political things, like the jury system and all of that, all happened in Athens and surrounding city-states. This was an amazing time period, okay? And so when you're looking at the timeline with Persia versus Greece, you have, as I said, the Ionian Revolt right here. It begins. And here comes Darius the First. And he basically goes all the way to Asia Minor, and then he sends two generals that get in on just a huge navy, Persian navy, and they cross the sea and they invade the mainland of Greece. And they're going after them. Okay, well, as they go after them, Athens knows that they're targeted. They are the first ones because they gave help to the Ionian Revolt. So they immediately say to Sparta, Sparta, will you help us? And they figure this will really bring a lot of, because Spartans, they're the greatest warriors on earth. Sparta says, no, we're doing a religious festival, which was probably the most ridiculous thing they could have ever said. But to them, they were doing a religious festival, and they couldn't fight during that time. And by the way, Greeks, when they fought one another, would stop for two things: religious festivals and their Olympics, because that really was a religious festival to the gods, okay? So they would literally stop wars and say, okay, we're going to do our religious thing, and then they would pick right back up afterward. It's quite funny to us. Okay, so they said, no, we're not going to help. So Athens gets together a few more city-states, and remarkably, I mean, the history behind the Battle of Marathon is absolutely stunning to me. I don't have time to tell you about the battle, though. They remarkably win that battle. And of course, then there's that legend of Phidippides running 26.2 miles from the plain of Marathon to the city of Athens, and they're all in there, and they're just waiting for the news, because otherwise they are going to be annihilated if they lose. And he comes in and says, victory is ours, and drops down dead, according to the legend. I don't know how much of that is true, but we get our marathon from that, the 26.2 miles, okay? So Darius finds out, this didn't work. The generals, then their whole army is starving. They go back to Asia Minor. So Darius dies. Xerxes, his son, comes back and he says, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it. This was 490, Battle of Marathon. 10 years later, Xerxes comes back and he says, I'm going to finish what my father could not do, and I'm doing it personally. Well, this time he takes an army with elephants and all sorts of things, and he builds a floating bridge in the Hellespont. Look what he did right here in this area, right there. He built a floating bridge and crossed that unbelievably large army. Some people say up to 150,000, and went over this way and came down just creaming everybody that did not give Persian allegiance. So now, this time, everybody's thinking, we got a bad problem. Sparta is in on it. They're not having a religious festival. And of course, you have the very, very famous, the Battle of the 300, as they call it, the Battle of What is my problem? The Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 plus, there were 300 Spartans plus about 700 Thebans. And we're not talking about Thebes in Egypt like he talked about. There was another Thebes in Greece, okay, from which the Egyptians got their name, that name. So the original Thebes was in Greece. And those Thebans from that city-state fought along with the Spartans. They held off Xerxes and his army, probably killed 20,000 of them in that pass. And then after that, Xerxes was able to get around because of a traitor and go behind them and annihilate them, and then he just went crazy. And so by this time, it was good because Athens in the 10 years between 490 and 480 decided we've got to have a bigger navy. So they had a really big navy at that time. So when they knew that this horde was coming against them, all of the citizens of Athens got in the ships and left and went to the islands and let them have the city. They burned it to the ground. Okay, so Athens didn't look very good once Xerxes got done. But then there was a battle of Salamis in which the navy was able to defeat the Persian army. Already the Persians were starting to find out that the Athenians and the Spartans had burned everything in the land so that they could not sustain themselves in the land. Their army started to starve, and Xerxes is thinking, I'm going to be stuck here without a navy to take me home. So he had to go back. So he had to go all the way back over the Hellespont, over those bridges, get back to the right place, and he was defeated. And so the second big Persian war is won by the Greeks. And then later on, you have in 479, about a year later, Xerxes leaves some of them there, and then there's a battle of Plataea in which the Greeks were decisively victorious. And at that time, that was it. That was the end of the Persian wars in 479, and then Greece just goes, yes, we are masters of our own. And Athens says, we're going to build the city of Athens to the most beautiful place the world has ever seen. And they did. Okay, so it must have been a stunning, absolutely. This is what one artist's rendition is of Athens. It's got the Parthenon up there. It's got the temples up there. It's got all these things. By the way, these were built by rich Athenians. That's what they were expected to do since they were rich. We should learn to do that in art. They were expected to build libraries for all of the poorer people. They were expected to build the buildings and all of the political buildings and everything else because they had gained so much from the wealth of that city-state. I thought that was kind of interesting. So it must have been a beautiful city-state. At any rate, during this time, they start fighting one another again. And so they go through what's called a Peloponnesian War, and they almost kill each other. Athens and Sparta just war for like 30 years. It's horrible. And they just find themselves in disarray. But there are three great philosophers that come during this time. Yes, the first one, Socrates, made fun of in a movie called Socrates, by those of you who have seen that crazy movie, is Socrates, who had a great student named Plato. And Plato had a great student named Aristotle, and Aristotle was employed to teach a young Alexander. Now, Alexander, guys, is not a Greek. He is a Macedonian. Let's go back just a minute. If you look right back here at this map, look where Macedon is, okay, Macedonia. It's right up here. That's Greek-related in a sense, but not of Greek heritage. Okay, and so therefore, you got Philip II as king up there. He has a son named Alexander, and at the age of 19, Philip is assassinated. And Alexander says, I'll take on his army. I can't imagine at the age of 19 saying, I'll do that job. That's just amazing to me. So he does. And one of the things he's been taught by Aristotle, who's been taught by Plato, who's been taught by Socrates, so he's been taught to love Greek culture. And I want you to know that is huge. Had Alexander the Great been just taught to be a Macedonian and be a nationalist that way, and not been taught that really the Greek heritage is one of the greatest heritages that he would ever know, then that guy would have not changed the world like he did. So Alexander the Great comes on the scene, and what he first does is he says, this ridiculous business of city-states killing one another is going to stop. And so he stops it by conquering them, and then says, you will no longer fight against one another. In fact, I'm going to bring about a dream that you've had. We're going to take over the Persian Empire. And so Alexander and other Greeks had developed a kind of warfare. I can't talk about it very long, but it's called hoplite warfare. And those hoplites were excellent, excellent warriors. And they provided some of the way that they would attack an enemy. And this is the first time in history. The Athenians used it, and the Spartans used it, and others used it. Spartan used it at Thermopylae, the phalanx, in which they banded together and put the armor over them so that the first barrage of arrows came in and it just bounced off. And they were able to figure out a military strategy in which these hoplites, who had 8-foot-long spears, could take on another army with lesser numbers and have an advantage, which is what they were able to do in certain places like Marathon and the Battle of Plataea, etc. Okay, so their advantage was not that they overwhelmed the enemy. For the first time in history, major battles were won by tactical events, by the way an army was trained. Alexander believed in that. He had an army of 35,000 to 40,000, and he was going to take on the Persian Empire, which would have well over 100,000. So he takes off. We don't have a lot of time to talk about it. But in 331 BC, he starts conquering. And the moment he meets up with Darius III, he utilizes hoplite warfare, puts the Persians to flight. Darius runs off and leaves his mother behind. His mother was supposed to be there to watch the battle and her son with great victory over Alexander the Great, and she is left to be captured. It's so embarrassing. By Alexander, who treated her very well, by the way. And Alexander, just let her go along with him as they continued on. But what he does, I know this is hard to see, he starts over here, and he comes in this area, and he has his first battle here called Issus in 333 BC. Now, what is very important is that after that, he just comes straight down into Palestinian area, straight down the Levant, as we called it. And as he comes down, he comes against Tyre, as we've said. He scrapes up the city of Tyre. After he takes the mainland of Tyre, scrapes up the city, puts it into a causeway, and goes out to the island of Tyre and captures it. The man was amazing in his tactical, military tactics, that is. And then he goes down to Egypt, which had constantly revolted against the Persians. And as when he comes there, he's hailed as a deliverer. So he doesn't have to. Now, this is important, and it's important to biblical history. He is hailed as a deliverer, and so he doesn't have to fight a battle. Egypt just basically says, we're yours, and we're done with the Persians. And so at that, he has in his mind that he will build the new cultural center of the world there in Egypt, and that he would name after himself, and it would be called Alexandria. Now, Alexander, in his lifetime, started about 13 Alexandrias all across his empire. But the greatest one, yeah, I know, had a little problem with ego. But the greatest one was the one in Egypt, which will have something to do with the Old Testament being translated. Okay, in just a few moments, that's going to happen. Okay, so anyway, he comes back. So if, the battle of Issus is won, comes down here, wins these battles, comes down here, takes Egypt as just kind of like a prize, goes back over here, and then meets Darius III for the second time. Darius III's mother is watching this, and the same tactics work again, and it puts Darius III to flight and all of the Persian army to flight. And so by the time he takes this battle, the Battle of Gaugamela, is how I would say it, in 331, the Persian Empire is just in chaos. Darius III is murdered by his own men because he's lost twice and run from the battle scene twice. And Alexander the Great goes on. He conquers the rest of the Persian Empire. He even then goes to the Indus Valley and fights to an unbelievably, narrow victory over the Indian prince. and was so honored by fighting such a great warrior that after he wins, he shakes hands with the guy and basically says, I want to put you as governor under my rule. And the Indian prince said, okay, I can stay in power. And so then he goes back. There are about 150 traditional, beautiful, too, just myths that go on about Alexander the Great in ancient Indian history. It is so fascinating to read about what they made up that this guy did, because they thought of him as a great conqueror. They were kind of honored that he would come all the way there and think that their land was worthy of being conquered. Crazy, crazy. Okay, anyway, at the age of 32, Alexander comes back to Babylon. That's where he's going to make the political capital of the world. His cultural capital that's going to take the place of Athens is going to be Alexandria in Egypt. His political capital, he's going to build Babylon like it was never built before, and he dies of a fever. Okay, but you got to say, and I have often said whenever I'm teaching history, that the only individual, the only human that has had a greater effect on human history by his single deeds other than Jesus Christ, and I would say that to my sixth graders, was Alexander the Great. Absolutely important, because wherever he went, he spread Greek values. Wherever he went, he spread them. He built Greek-like cities wherever. And when he died, his empire went to the generals. Here's the division of about 300 BC now. And this division is very important to Israelite history, which we're going to talk about for the remainder of the period here and bring it up to the time when the Romans come on the scene. So the division of the empire goes to his generals, and the one general that gets that area right there, which has Alexandria in it, is Ptolemy. P-T-O-L, yeah, the P is silent. We call him Ptolemy the First, and this guy has all the way up to just north of Tyre, and the Seleucids hold this area, which is very important also in Israelite history. And then you've got Macedonia over here, you've got Thrace over here, and so then you have all of these are the four generals that kind of took that area. Well, as soon as Ptolemy takes it, there is an infusion of Greek ideas, values, etc., right into Palestine. Now remember, this is not going to be something that many of the Jews are going to be willing to accept. They build gymnasiums where guys, go working out in the nude. They build statues to all sorts of Greek gods wherever they go. They worship all these Greek gods wherever they go. They build these cities. Politically speaking, they don't believe in kingdoms so much, even though these are kings, basically. And they believe in democratic rule at times, and it's just strange. Very, very strange. This influx of Hellenism, we call it, okay? This Hellenistic influx, because it comes from the word Hellas, which was the ancient name for Greece, then caused a reaction in Israel. And there was going to be a division of those that were going to be more liberal and those that were going to be more conservative. And those that were more liberal ended up being called the Sadducees. Okay, and we'll learn. And those that were much more conservative and right-wing were those that were called the Pharisees. All right, so let's go on. Now, Alexandria, Egypt, it was a beautiful city. It must have been an absolutely fantastic city. And by the way, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Alexandrian lighthouse, or the lighthouse of Alexandria, was supposed to be in that city too. Okay, the Library of Alexandria, this is another artist's rendition of it, must have just looked absolutely amazing. Okay, we'll talk about that in just a few moments. And then, well, we're going to talk about it right now, okay? We're going to jump ahead and then come back. Okay, so what the library had as their purpose was anyone who had some sort of scroll. You might call it a book, but they didn't have books back then. They had scrolls, okay, manuscripts that was on papyrus, especially in Egypt where they invented papyrus, okay? Anybody that would come to that city, or if they found out about a very important writing, whether it was literature, whether it was law, no matter what it was, They had to surrender when they walked into the city, and when they left, they would be given back their original copy, and their scribes would write it down, and they would put it in the library there. So the Library of Alexandria, by the time the AD period occurs, has probably all of the information and science, math, astronomy, astrology, politics, literature, everything is housed in that library. It's ancient Google. You are exactly right. What a great thing. You just go there and consult it a little bit differently. They have these little places where you just stick all of those papyri in there. You can go grab a scroll and you could read it. Well, guess what they wanted to write? You see, the Jews, when they came in contact with the Jews over there, the Ptolemaic rulers said, well, we got to have that Old Testament. We got to have that. So in about the 200s BC, they have what are called 70, and this is according to legend again, but it's a great, because it helps you understand the word. The Septuagint, or Septuagint as how some people say it, was translated. That meant that the Old Testament was actually being translated into the Greek, which was the language of the entire world at that time. Everybody who was anybody learned Greek as well as their original language, okay? So according to legend, Ptolemy basically said, the Ptolemaic rulers said, we want you to take that Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, translated over the next few hundred years. They translated all the Old Testament. Why is that important? Why would that be important for the Old Testament to be completely translated into Greek before the coming of Jesus? Think about it. The world could know the prophecies. Yes. What else?
What I was going to say is that the prophecies were going to be there before anything could be fulfilled.
Very good. Very good. Okay. It is in the common language of everyone. Just about everybody in the world now can read it. Kurt.
The Gentile world gets introduced to Yahweh.
Yes, that's right. So this is hugely important. And when Paul the Apostle says that he refers to scriptures, he is referring to something. He actually, when we go back and look at his writings, he actually used some of the phrases from the Septuagint in his writings. He knows about it. And so it's huge. Alexandria is huge. And this idea of knowing everything that we can know in the world and sharing this information was the Greek way. This is bringing about God's will for the world to get ready for his kingdom. So since the Greek was it's called lingua franca, of the Roman Empire, that means the established, accepted language of all the Roman Empire. This paved the way for the spread of Christianity. Okay, now it also caused that reaction, all right? And so we talked about the Sadducees. They were very politically minded. They saw this as an opportunity to get the high priesthood in their lineage, and as a Sadducee, okay? And so they took control of the high priesthood. They had a literal understanding of the Torah. They did not believe in the oral traditions, which we're going to find that the Pharisees did. They did not believe in a resurrection. And I remember my wife teaching the little kids, you see, the Sadducees are called Sadducees because they were sad, you see, because they did not believe in a resurrection. Okay, it's a really good way to teach kids that. All right, and they concentrated on temple worship rather than synagogue worship. Now, synagogue worship, remember, had come about during the exilic period, during the exile. And so they didn't have a temple, remember? So they started doing these houses of worship all over the diaspora, all over the dispersed Jewish communities all over the world that were taken all over the world. And this was God's way, even though he takes them into exile, of having his word known and having a people right there in a heathen city that are going to worship in a synagogue right there. They probably thought they were weird, but at least they would know about Yahweh and about their ways, okay? So the Pharisees, they are political separatists. We don't want to have anything to do with Greeks, not anything at all. They believed also in an oral law, which later was written down, called the Talmud. That is extremely important in Judaism today, the Talmud. Okay, they believed that Moses was not only given a written law, but he was given the oral interpretation of that law, which was inspired by God, and that others wrote it down who were Moses's associates. Guess what Jesus called that later on? The traditions of men. In Matthew 15, he takes them to task for that, because those traditions they believed were law, just like you shall not kill. They believed that oral tradition, and the Sadducees did not believe in that, but the Pharisees did. They believed in an afterlife, they concentrated on synagogue worship, and had grown up during the period of exile and continued throughout the diaspora. Okay, so you got this going on. All right, now what happens in history from the Ptolemies, who are basically religious, although they're introducing Greek ways, religiously, they are giving them religious freedom. So once again, temple worship is going on. All the things are happening in Jerusalem that are supposed to happen. And all of a sudden, the Seleucids in their empire. Okay, question. Yes, did I go too fast?
Well, I'm just confused about one thing.
Okay,
You said the Sadducees concentrated on temple worship,
yes.
but they didn't have temple?
No, they have the temple at that time. The second temple has been built.
That's my confusion.
Yes. Remember that the second temple is completed. Yes, when Zerubbabel and them come back in 516 BC, that's already completed. So they have a temple at this time. Yeah, sometimes you forget Nebuchadnezzar destroyed that temple, but they still have one 70 years later. They've got it started, and they completed in 516 BC. Okay, good question. All right, yes, sir.
If I'm getting my years anywhere in the ballpark, during the whole thing you had talked about where the Greeks were fighting the Persians and getting Athens going and
Yeah.
stuff again was kind of simultaneous with the return from exile.
Exactly right.
establishment of-
Yeah, right when the Greeks are in their heyday, and the classical Greek history we study and all of that, and the philosophers, etc., Nehemiah and Ezra are doing their job. They're doing their job, okay? And the temple is built right before what we call the Golden Age of Greece, which kind of started with the revolts and ended with the Peloponnesian War going very badly when Athens and Sparta they just got into league with everybody, and they did a World War I thing. They just killed each other off, with everybody deciding whose side they were on. It was bad. Okay, now, scroll forward, and we're going to go really fast here, but you don't need to know much more than this. That the Seleucids started fighting the Ptolemies in what were called the Syrian Wars. There were 6 of them. In the 6th one, the Seleucids won, and the Ptolemies lost Israel. And the Seleucids took it over. They couldn't take Egypt. They wanted to, but they were repulsed at the Egyptian border. So the Ptolemaic rulers stayed on in Egypt, but now the Seleucids have them in 167 BC. When they win that last Syrian war, they come into Jerusalem, and this guy named Antiochus IV, who won that battle, was their king at that time, and he decided, oh no, we're not allowing this temple worship to go on. He puts a statue of Zeus inside the temple, a statue of Zeus, and he has them sacrifice swine on the altar of the temple. Yeah, I write in my notes, yikes. This is like, if there's anything you can make Jews really mad at, that would be it. Now, most every area had been Hellenized. They went on and they just became Greek-like in almost every area. But when it came to Jerusalem, oh man, those Jews were fit to be tied when that happened. So there was a man named Mattathias, and he was of the household of Hasmoneus, okay? And he was a Levitical priest. And he was out in the rural area, but it was near Jerusalem in Judea, and he was getting ready to sacrifice when an emissary of Antiochus comes up. A Greek guy says, you're going to sacrifice swine on this altar right here, and you're going to sacrifice it to one of the Greek gods. Well, Mattathias just refused. He just, nope, not going to do it. So the guy just turned to another priest and says, you do it. And so that guy's scared. So he goes up to do it, and Mattathias loses it. He finds a sword, and he kills the priest that tried to do that, and also he killed the Greek emissary from Antiochus, and then he runs into the Judean wilderness and starts the first guerrilla warfare that I've ever heard of. And that guy, later on, he becomes known as the Hammer, because they would hit and they would run. They would hit and they would run. So it's their word for hammer is Maccabee. So he was called Mattathias the Maccabee. Well, he dies real soon. However, one thing that he does is he wins enough battles to where they free Jerusalem from this Hellenization. They go in, and during this time, in 165 BC, they cleanse the temple, and they restore they get rid of the statue of Zeus. They restore everything. But there's a legend that goes on. And the legend says this, that they came in at night, so they were holding torches when they went in and cleansed the temple. They did the cleaning all night long, and the next day they were getting ready to light the menorah, the candlestick. And as they looked for sacred oil that had not been tainted by the Greeks, they only had enough for one day. So they lit the menorah, but a miracle happened. It went on for 8 days. And ladies and gentlemen, the birth of Hanukkah. Okay, that's where it comes. By the way, Jesus celebrated that feast. He went to Jerusalem. In the Bible, in John 10, verse 22, it's called the Feast of Dedication, because that's when they dedicated or rededicated the temple again. So Jesus went to Jerusalem during that time. Now, whether he participated in all of the Hanukkah things and all of that, I don't know. Okay. By the way, you know how dreidels are used? The original dreidels were a little game that children, they used them in warfare, that children would use, and they would spin the dreidels around, and some of the guerrillas would come in and write messages on some of the dreidels. They would inscribe them on there about when they were going to assault the Greeks. And so the kids would be doing the dreidels, and somebody would come up and say, basically, what are you playing? And they'd pick up a dreidel, and they would get the information that way. So that's why Jewish children to this day play dreidel games, and that's why they have 8 days of giving gifts together, and that's why they celebrate it in December, because that's when it happened, okay? That's when the rededication occurred. All right, anyway, that's Feast of Hanukkah. So we go on. Well, they go on, and in an amazing way, they keep winning victory after victory until finally, small victory after small victory, until finally Antiochus gets really angry and brings down a huge force. By that time, the Jews are ready. They're not doing guerrilla warfare anymore. They've got the city of Jerusalem. They've got the walls of that city. They've got a formidable army. They have conquered. They have beaten them in several battles, the Greeks, and so they have their weapons and everything else, and they know the terrain, and they repulse Antiochus's army. Now, Antiochus could have come back with a bigger one and won, but he had other problems that were going on. At this time, do you remember? Well, you don't remember. I should have. In the Persian area is an area called, in the area of Persia, just north of that is an area called Parthia. And during the time of the Seleucids, especially in the 160s, the Persian nationalism is rising up, and Parthia is becoming now a Persian resurrection of the Persian Empire. And so they are starting to attack the Seleucids. They're wanting their land and everything back. So the Seleucids are having problems on this side, and Rome is coming in from the west, and Parthia is coming in from the east. So when the Jews win the battle against Antiochus, he basically says, enough, you can have your land. So they actually go into a time period of independence. And then we have a time period called the Hasmonean Kingdom after Mattathias, because Mattathias dies, and then he's got this son right here, Judah, who took over to win the very important battles. Judas dies in 161. Jonathan takes over, who is another son of Mattathias. He goes from 161 to 142 BC. And then after he dies, Simon, the youngest one, he goes from 142 to 134 BC. And then he has a son named John Hyrcanus. And that guy is seriously important to what happened in history. So this Hasmonean kingdom is basically now this area right here. And John Hyrcanus decides, I'm going to start conquering this area. And he'd say, why would he have to conquer the area they already have? Because it had been Hellenized. And they were angry at that. And they wanted it back. So he not only goes and starts conquering Transjordan over here, he starts conquering this area right here, and this area, which is ancient Edom, which is now called Idumea. And one of the interesting things is he has to go and kind of subdue Samaria and also Galilee, because they are so Hellenized that they are not following the old law. And so what John Hyrcanus does as king is he forces them to accept Judaism. He has all those Edomites, those old Edomites, Idumeans, he has them circumcised. Yeah, they become forced into the Jewish religion, which is quite shocking to me. But I'll tell you why that's important later on. That is very, very important. So anyway, we now have an entire area here that is controlled by the Hasmonean kingdom and by their kings. And by the way, they are not related to David. How do you know? Because Mattathias was a what? Of what tribe? He was a Levite. These are Levite kings, folks. They are not, we do not have David's lineage sitting on a throne during this time. These are Levite kings. Okay, so this is what happens, and then this is all of this all the way down here. Do you see that guy's name right there? Oh my goodness. What's his name right there? Herod the Great. Okay, so he's going to come into what's going to happen during that time period, because after the Maccabean revolt, after this time period of the Hasmonean kingdom, then once again they begin fighting against one another. So this revolt starts in, so I'm just going to review this with you real quickly. 167 to 160 BC, the revolt happens. In 165 BC, the temple is cleansed, Hanukkah is initiated. When Rome, coming from the west, and Parthian Empire, resurgence of the Persian Empire coming from the east, the Seleucid Empire began to crumble, creating a power vacuum where the Jews began to assert their independence. And then you got this Hasmonean period, dynasty as they call it, occurring from 140 to 116 BC, and in 135 BC, John Hyrcanus, which is the grandson of Mattathias, begins to expand the Jewish kingdom, and he subjugates them and forces the Idumeans to become Jewish, or proselytes, basically, all right? Now, then you have, after a series of civil wars, after the Hasmonean kingdom, they start fighting against one another. And I'm not going to give you all of the details of that. I'm just going to say this is what happens in all of this time period from about 110 BC to 63 BC. They're just fighting against one another constantly, trying to get control. And as they do that, Rome is getting more and more and more powerful, coming down from the north. They've already gotten Egypt under their control. They are getting, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra are doing their thing. Cleopatra, by the way, is a who ruler? What ruler? She's Egyptian, but she's Ptolemaic. She's a descendant of the first Ptolemy, the general. So she's a Ptolemaic rule, and she kind of joined together with Mark Antony, and they were going to have this Eastern Roman Empire, whereas over here, Octavian was going to have this Western Roman, or Julius Caesar was going to have this Western Roman Empire, and I'll tell you that later on, what happens next week. But at any rate, while all of this intrigue is going on in Palestine, and they're fighting against one another, here comes Pompey, and he's a general. And he's of the Roman army, and he captures Jerusalem. But before that time, Herod the Great goes all the way to Rome, or Herod, excuse me. He's an Idumean, and he is descended from one of John Hyrcanus's right-hand men, because he utilized Idumeans while he did his conquering. And so he's a descendant of him, and he shrewdly talks to the people in Rome and others, and he's wanting power. And so he positions himself that by the time Pompey comes in and later on, he is given in 36 BC the right to rule under Rome. Now, you think the Jews would accept him? First of all, he's not a real Jew, is he? He's a descendant from Edom, which is a descendant from Esau, who was that vile, horrible man, you know. And anyway, he got forced in his family to accept Judaism. He doesn't really care about it, and they were absolutely right. Herod the Great could care less about Judaism. He just wanted power. So when he gets power, he calls himself. The Romans didn't call him this. He calls himself, he takes on the title, I'm King of the Jews, which they allowed because he was, you know, so to speak, in bed with the Romans. He had just kind of, you know, fomented this relationship with them to get this kind of power. And when he gets that kind of power, then he holds on to it. Isn't it interesting that Herod the Great called himself King of the Jews? What was on Jesus' cross? King of the Jews. Okay. You know, it's just so interesting to me. And what did Herod want to do when he found out that Jesus was born? Kill them all, because he was going to be the King of the Jews. It wasn't going to be Jesus. All right. So this is how you have Herod coming into that position. Go ahead. By the way, we'll talk next week about why he was called the Great. You're probably thinking, why is that man called the Great? He did everything evil he could do for power. And you're right. He killed his own mother. He killed his own mother for power. I just, you know, sometimes I get mad at my mom, but I just cannot imagine doing that. Okay, Alicia.
Is he the one then that enhanced the temple?
Yes.
So big?
Yes. That's his way of getting in good with the Sadducees and the rest of the political ones that were still Greek-oriented and Roman-oriented. He says, I'm going to rebuild this area. I'm going to make Jerusalem to be the greatest city on earth other than Rome. And I think he achieved that. And that's why he was called Herod the Great. Yes?
What was the adjective you used that Alexander used a type of war? I couldn't.
Hoplite. Warfare. Okay?
It sounds like pop. You're saying.
Hop. Hoplite. I'm sorry. Okay. Hoplite warfare. Any other questions? Yes, Kurt.
Just it kind of ties into something Jesus thought about. When Herod was doing all this positioning and was declared to be the ruler, the Jews actually sent a delegation to Rome and said, we don't want this man to rule.
Oh, I did not know that. That's interesting.
Jesus touches on it in the parable. The king went into a far country to receive the kingdom, and in such he says, we do not have this man to rule over us.
Oh, very good.
The Roman said,
Excellent.
he's already picked,
Yeah.
and that's what set Herod off a little bit.
Yeah.
He got back and
Yeah.
started his war.
And of course, it's so ironic that the Jews absolutely hated the Romans, as we'll find later on, and yet they said at Jesus' crucifixion, we have no king but Caesar. Yeah. I can't think of a Jewish thing that they would say that's any more traitorous than that. Yes?
Was the library in Alexandria burned?
Well, I've looked it up, and I've studied it, and again, I would think that is, if you think of a secular disaster in the world, and I know I'm not under any circumstances diminishing Holocaust. Please don't, say that I'm doing that. But as far as a secular disaster in human history, that I think was the greatest. Because we lost out on how Egyptians did brain surgery. We know they did it because we see it in their tomb paintings. They're doing surgery on people's heads and opening them up, etc. And it's just amazing what we lost in that. And the world, I do not know, but it was probably somewhere. It may have been a series of fires. Most people think it was a fire. And so since everything was papyri, then it just went up in flames. And we don't even have archaeological evidence of the library. We kind of know where it was, but we're not finding anything there. And we just have Josephus's, and now it was there during his time, so we consider Josephus to be a reputable historian because he talks about that library and how it ran and what they were doing. It is even blamed on a Christian ruler that the fire went on, because as Alexandria became more and more Christian in the 300s AD, he ordered the burning of the library according to some historical evidence. I don't happen to believe that one. I don't think there's enough evidence for it. I think it was just prone to fire in the area. Others have said that intruders have come in and warriors came in and this and that, and